A very good morning to absolutely everyone here. I hope everybody's having a really, really good Friday morning. Welcome to ICDM webinar series titled Virtual Board Meetings in an Era of Social Distancing Boards. We'll actually start in a couple of minutes, but for those already here, please permit me some housekeeping. Just some rules. As you notice, your mic is actually automatically muted when you join, but don't worry, there are actually a lot of ways where you can reach out to us because on the Zoom tab, there are two tabs. There's the Q&A tab, which will be used for later, and one for chat. Questions to our speaker will be in the Q&A tab and we'll answer them at the end of the session. But if any technical difficulties, questions, or you want to know anything more, please feel free to drop us a chat, which is probably on the side box. The entire session is recorded. We'll send you a copy after. And if you wish to leave the webinar at any point for any reason, you can rejoin if it is still in progress. I will see you in about 5 minutes or so. So hang tight, have a coffee, see you in a bit. A very good Friday morning to absolutely everyone. Welcome to the ICDM webinar series. Thank you again for joining us so early this Friday. Your participation is so much appreciated. And just for what I call it, just for in case you missed it, today's topic is actually virtual board meetings in an era of social distancing boards. Before that, let me just allow me to do some brief housekeeping rules. As you mentioned, your mic is automatically muted when you join, as is your video. But don't worry, there are actually a lot of ways where you can contact us. On the Zoom tab, there is two tabs. There's the Q&A tab and there's the chat tab. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A tab and we'll answer it, of course, at the end of the session. But if you're having any kind of technical difficulties or you want to know a lot more about ICDM programs, there is the chat box for you there, and a lot of us will actually help. Entire sessions recorded. We'll send you a copy after. And if you wish to leave at any point in time, you can. You will be able to rejoin if it is still in progress. Once again, welcome and good morning to ICDM's webinar series. Our speaker this morning is the wonderfully effervescent Dottie Schillinger, who is an executive director of the Diligent Institute. But before we kick off, please allow me to introduce Michelle Kaiti Lim, President and CEO of ICDM, to give her welcoming remarks. Take it away.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to everyone tuning in from Asia. Good afternoon to those in Australia, and good evening to our facilitator colleagues, Dottie and her team, who are based in New York. Welcome to today's webinar. For some of you who are joining us for the first time, the ICDM webinar series was first created as part of our response to COVID-19. It aims to offer boards and directors a platform to seek clarity on challenges facing boardrooms amidst this pandemic. As we now move into the rebuilding phase, we understand that it is even more crucial for the director and the corporate governance community to have a platform to come together, to share lessons learned, and to enable each other to take the most effective steps towards recovery. We will thus continue to run the webinar series as part of our central initiative, what we call the ICDM Reimagine and Rebuild, to provide further support to our collective rebuilding journey. Now, for today's webinar, we are extremely honored to have the opportunity to work with the Diligent Institute, which is a think tank with an objective very much aligned with ours, i.e. to promote good governance. In the current climate of rapid change, it has never been more critical for boards and directors to commit to the highest standards of governance practices. Now, however, being unable to meet in person has, we understand to some extent, disrupted the dynamics, the flow of communication, the decision-making process amongst board members. Now, though the means to meet online are abundantly available, many directors share certain concerns we know over its effectiveness. Now, for example, can a board member present his or her thoughts convincingly in front of a screen? How do we pick up the nuances and non-verbal cues that are such an integral part of a boardroom setting, particularly in Asia? Now, in today's webinar, we hope to address some of these worries that you may have and explore the fact that virtual board meetings can be a comparable and viable alternative to in-person meetings, more so in these fast-changing times. The key, we believe, is to relook at the role of everyone involved in the meetings, from the chair to the company secretary, and the things we need to do differently before, during, and after the virtual meetings. Now, Dottie is a recognized expert in the intersection of governance and technology. Therefore, we feel she's well positioned today to help shed light on this matter. Now, before we move on to her presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Hakan for graciously accepting our invitation to share his thoughts from the perspective of a chairperson on how virtual meetings, remote work, and digital collaboration have impacted board processes. Now, Hakan was a panel member during our International Directors Summit last year and is a familiar face to us. Now, earlier this month, Hakan chaired the virtual AGM for DG.com Berhad, which is amongst the 79 listed companies in Malaysia that have held virtual general meetings since April 2020. His personal insights will be invaluable in helping us to ensure our virtual general meetings are productive and able to engage with the shareholders meaningfully. Now, in Malaysia, the adoption of virtual general meetings has been relatively slow. Apart from technical considerations, many companies have found, in fact, affordability to be amongst the barriers. Now, to this end, we have made available an affordable, integrated platform where companies can take advantage to organize fully virtual as well as hybrid meetings. You're welcome to reach out to us if you would like to chat more about this, so please do. Now, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately or fortunately, social distancing is here to stay. And to ensure excellence in governance is maintained, all of us in the CG, i.e. corporate governance community, must be open to adopting a new mindset and way of work using technology tools. With this, I hope you will have a meaningful session this morning for us in Asia this morning. And please do enjoy the webinar. Thank you very much. Back to you, Nadia.
Thanks a lot for that, Michelle, and definitely a lot to kind of chew over. But as she mentioned, today following our speaker's presentation, we will actually have an insights exchange with Hakum Brauset-Joel, who is Senior VP and Head of External Relations of Telenor Group and Chairman of Digi.com. That will be followed by the Q&A. But before that, as we mentioned multiple times, today's topic is talking about virtual board meetings in an era of social distancing boards. I mean, as Michelle pointed out, the fact that we're even holding this digitally is a testament that COVID has greatly disrupted our ability to hold board meetings, and not just board meetings, any meetings, let's be honest, in person. I attended an event yesterday, and it was the first in-person event that I attended in 3 months, and it still felt strange. The thing is, as we navigate the shift to meeting in virtual environment, or at least making a lot of them, a lot of us have questions as both board members and stakeholders. Things like compliance, effective decision-making. We are in a brand new world, everyone. But I think today's speaker will shed some light on that. Dottie, as I've mentioned before, is an executive director of the Diligent Institute, the governance think tank and research arm of Diligent Corporation. Her specialty is actually the intersection of governance and technology. She has co-authored a book. It's called Governance in a Digital Age, a guide for the modern corporate board director. And she even has a fortnightly podcast called the Corporate Director Podcast. And with that introduction, please take it away, Dottie.
Thank you so much, and good day, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. Let me pull up my camera so that you can actually see me. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm excited to have the opportunity to present this session to you. I sort of wish that we were all together live in a room, but what is, I think, kind of wonderful is that we have the opportunity to continue to connect even during this time of social distancing. And it's great as I've been sitting here and watching some of the chat messages come in, getting ready for this webinar. I noticed that a few of you were mentioning that, you know, you've been doing virtual board meetings for quite some time. It wasn't a new thing during the COVID-19 crisis. And that is true for some organizations, but for others, this was a dramatic transition. And so for many companies, you know, virtual board meetings were something that we used when we needed to. It was a fallback position if we couldn't all gather together in one room. And it was never considered the default or preferred way of meeting. But during this time of social distancing and shelter-in-place orders and other regulations from our different jurisdictions, we really didn't have a choice. We either had to use tools like we're using right now with Zoom to meet with one another and to proceed with business, or not meet at all. And that really wasn't an option, particularly as the crisis expanded from a few days to a few weeks and now several months. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to share with you some of the best practices that we've been gathering from our conversations around the world with directors, as well as with company secretaries and executives at companies. And then also just share with you some ways that you can begin to maybe shift the thinking around the purpose of a meeting versus other ways to connect and collaborate and use digital tools to do that very seamlessly. So just to begin, we're going to just keep this very brief, and then we're going to invite my co-presenter Hakan to join us, and we'll have a conversation. We're going to start with just a little bit of context and background and where we think we might be heading with virtual meetings. I think we all have come to the realization that this is not a short-term phenomenon, and virtual meetings are here to stay. I think, especially with virtual board meetings, we may be doing this for many years to come, even after the pandemic is over, because we may find that, it's less risky, it's less expensive, and we have a different way of connecting. So we'll talk about some of the best practices. And then I will share with you some of the observations from the research that we've been doing at the Diligent Institute around the best practices for successful virtual meetings. But I'd like to start with a quick poll. And so if I could ask my kind people who are running the webinar from ICDM, if they wouldn't mind launching the poll. And if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and just answering this question briefly. It's always helpful to understand what are some of the things that are the biggest challenges that you're facing. As we go through the webinar, I can certainly spend a little time focusing on one area over another. And I'll just answer my own question here so I can sort of see what the results look like. And so as we get those results in, then maybe we could take a moment and share those up on the screen. I think there are a number of different challenges that many organizations have been facing. The first one on the list, I think it's worth spending some time talking about, and we will. I just actually, right before I started this webinar, I happened to glance at a news alert that was coming across my phone talking about how there are state actors that are working on pretty widespread schemes around cybercrime during this time of remote work. They're sort of seeing people who are working from home and spending so much more time online as potential targets for cybercrime. And so secure communication certainly is something that has taken a lot more time, I think, for boards than maybe it has in the past. So I don't know if we have an opportunity to share the results of the poll with everyone, and whether or not that's something people can see. Excellent. So, so we have a pretty good dispersion here of the different challenges that you're facing. Secure communications certainly being the top at 34%. The next one down, the meeting protocols with participants at 26%. And then, of course, kind of an even distribution between collaborating securely, visibility across all of your entities, especially if you're working remotely, and then providing curated and relevant information. So we'll touch on all five, but it's good to see that the challenges that you're facing are in line with, I think, some of the most important areas to focus some time as a board. So let's continue on. So we'll go back to the slide deck here. I want to start out by just sharing with you some of the observations from our latest report from the Diligent Institute. The beginning of the pandemic, we began holding interviews with directors from around the world to try to understand what were some of the things about corporate governance that were changing during this time of crisis. And of course, this is not the first time that companies have faced crisis, but this is definitely a crisis of an unprecedented scope and scale. And the resulting economic problems, the resulting levels of unemployment, all of the shutdowns, the disruptions to supply chains, the political uncertainty that is coming along with this pandemic, all of those things have created a great deal of uncertainty for companies. And we don't really have a clear understanding on the global stage of when this is going to be over. And at least at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation around how do we get back to normal? And I think now there's much greater realization that there may never be a getting back to the way things were before this experience, but there may be a new normal or a next normal that comes out as a result of this experience. So some of the things that we've heard in those interviews and in the research that we've been collecting throughout the pandemic that seem to matter more than other things. First and foremost, the strong leadership. So having the ability to provide very clear information, taking a very proactive approach, being very transparent about the plans, and also being very transparent about the fact that plans are going to need to change. And this is something that is kind of unique to the situation that we've all found ourselves in. Quite often when there is a disaster or where there is a crisis, there's a plan that is put into place, and then that plan is really rigorously followed. And the communication all centers on a plan that is enacted from start to finish with maybe a little deviation in between, but it pretty much proceeds the way that the plan was written. What I think has been very interesting during this time is that plans have had to shift multiple times, and there has become a new appreciation for an agile approach to leadership. So strong leadership doesn't mean inflexibility. In fact, it means the opposite. Also, we've been hearing from directors the importance of culture. And culture takes on a number of different aspects, including what is the board culture? Is there a culture of curiosity? Is there a culture of inquisitiveness on the part of board members? That becomes incredibly important as we start to talk about having meetings remotely and using digital tools for communication, because you want to have a way for directors to be able to satisfy that curiosity, to do research, to dig in and understand the context of what's happening, understand what is happening within the company, but to do it in a way that doesn't provide a distraction from the day-to-day operations. That becomes very, very critical when we're in the middle of a crisis. How can we make sure to stay in contact with one another, but without getting in each other's way? And then, of course, having the opportunity for secure communication and collaboration, that has been particularly important during this crisis, because the nature of the crisis may involve leaders to have to transmit information about individual health, about personally identifiable information if it's related to particular employees that are at risk or are in danger. There have been a number of situations where companies have had to enact their emergency succession plans because someone in a key role has fallen ill to the virus. And those kinds of communications have to be secured. They include, in many cases, data that is got to be protected, especially data that is of a certain class, that it is protected by different laws. And so using channels for communication that are secure has become extremely important. And then, as I mentioned, the existing plans for many companies, they found we might have had plans for different kinds of disasters, but we didn't really have plans for something of this scale. And so using the basic plan, but then rapidly iterating on that plan and being able to keep the lines of communication open has been incredibly important. And finally, I will say the biggest lesson learned from this is that in the past, there has been a feeling that digital competency on the part of directors could sort of be optional. You didn't need every single board member to be a digital wizard, or someone who is a computer scientist. It was okay if you have some directors who really don't use any digital technology, maybe are a little bit more comfortable with paper, a little bit more comfortable with traditional ways of communication. That was okay. But this experience has sort of proven that we have reached a tipping point, and it's really no longer optional for any board members to use digital technology. This has now, I think, forever become part and parcel of the experience of being a corporate board member. So let's talk about how this all plays out. I think when we start to think about virtual board meetings, the most important question to ask first is, what do we actually mean by a meeting? Of course, when we get together in person, we are going through maybe some briefings about what's happening in the company. Obviously, we are voting on some issues. We're having good conversations. And sometimes the most important parts of the meeting happen outside the confines of the actual meeting room. We might have a hallway conversation during a break and come to some great realization that then changes the tenor of the conversation inside the room. We might share with each other an article that we've read and pass that around and share some information with one another. All of these things are a little bit different when we try to replicate them over a digital technology. And one of the things that many companies found at the very beginning of this pandemic was that having a virtual meeting, there was sort of this idea of, well, we just need to find the right video conference software and we'll be fine. But for many companies, that has not been sufficient, because just having a way for us to see and hear one another doesn't actually replicate the experience that we have when we are together in a meeting. And what I mean by that is, think about, for example, how we share information, right? So if we have one central place where at any time, whether we are in the meeting, whether it's leading up to the meeting or it's after the meeting, we have one central place where we can post something, make a comment on something, highlight something and share it with a colleague, write a note and share that with the management team, maybe ask the management team a question that they can answer at their convenience. Those are the kinds of things we often would think of as happening just in the confines of the meeting. But if we're now digital and remote, why do we need to do that? Why do we need to have a meeting for those things to occur? We don't. We have tools for this. We have lots of ways that we can share information securely. There are many opportunities for us to pass information back and forth, mark something up and make a note, have some type of collaboration that doesn't require us to be together on a video conference. And the reason that's so important is that the video conference technology is a little bit limited, isn't it? Only one person can speak at a time. We don't always have the opportunity to really understand how someone is feeling or what they're thinking or how something is really going. You know, if we're having a conversation, you can't always tell from the video cameras whether something is really landing with the board or not. And yet we usually can do that pretty intuitively when we're all together in a room. So we need to have other ways of thinking about things. The other thing that has come to light during this time is that this really is the future of work. This is the way that we should start to think about how we collaborate moving forward. Each board member is going to bring something to the conversation. They're going to be doing their own due diligence. They're going to be doing their own research because they recognize that it is all hands on deck. We all have to be involved. And again, it's not because they're trying to take the place of management or get in the way of the management team. They're trying to help and support the management team that can't possibly be thinking about everything all the time. So we need this flexibility and we need this fluidity. Very briefly, some best practices here. It's good to have a bit of a pre-meeting checklist. Now, I'm sure you've had virtual meetings already, but maybe some of the things that have come to light for you, may still be questions. So, for example, I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. Obviously, there are different laws in every part of the world, and particularly here in the US, the laws are not even just for the entire US, but by each state, and sometimes by each individual region within a state. There may be different regulations around what is allowed and not allowed, depending on what kind of organization you are. So, understanding the laws that govern virtual meetings are important. And quite often, there aren't laws about virtual meetings at all. There are laws about other things that get in the way of virtual meetings. And I'll give you an example. In the US, there are a number of states that have a rule that in order for you to vote, you need to be able to hear and see one another. And that can be really a big problem if we're all working remotely and we're using video conferencing technology and someone has a very bad Wi-Fi connection. Because as we all know, I think we've all been on a meeting where someone's Wi-Fi has not quite worked well and we can't hear or see them. And so then we have to wait for them to dial in, and sometimes their cell signal is not good. So that becomes a big barrier in some cases. You may also have to kind of look at your own bylaws and policies. Do you have any policies in your board manual that might get in the way of a good virtual meeting? Excuse me. So for example, what's the process by which you make a motion, handle a resolution? Do you have to, for example, get physical signatures on things? Once something has been voted in, there may be particular things you require a signature. How are you going to handle that digitally? And does your set of bylaws, your policies, does it allow for a digital signature? Do your laws in your area allow for digital signatures? These are the kinds of things you would want to check with counsel, and you would certainly want to check with your corporate secretary or, within your company, your general counsel, to look through your bylaws and policies just to make sure there's nothing there that needs to be updated or changed. And then when we actually get to the meeting itself, we have some questions, don't we? How do we establish quorum? If we have a very small board, it's a simple task at the beginning of the meeting to just do a roll call. But what if we're going to be in an organization where there's, maybe 20 or 30 people participating? Do we want to take the time in the meeting to go through a full roll call? It may not be practical. So you can potentially use, for example, in the video conferencing system, the list of people who are signing in. However, sometimes, as we know, all we see is a phone number. If we don't recognize the phone number, how do we match that person up? And how do we sort of figure out who's there? So just have to kind of think some of these things through. It's all manageable. It just may have to be thought through. But then quorum also becomes a question when you're in the middle of a virtual meeting. If someone stands up and clearly has walked away from the computer, are they still listening? Are they still participating in the meeting? We can't see them anymore on camera. What do we do? So having some provisions around what are your protocols? What are the things that you're going to require members to do? And what are the things that you're going to be considering as you take the minutes? Just making sure that you've thought these things through. And then in terms of voting, you can certainly do a voice vote. You may also be able to do a hand raise if you've got cameras on. But again, remembering that that may not always be available to you. So do you have a backup? Do you have a way to cast a vote virtually? Is there some type of a polling tool? And is that legal in your jurisdiction? These are all questions you would want to ask and really get the answers to for your particular situation. Then the questions around the agenda and the meeting flow, these are universal to every board. As we know, a virtual meeting is different. It is different than being together in a room. And it requires a different level of discipline, particularly on the part of the board chair. So you're going to want to think through the agenda for your meeting. It might have been perfectly reasonable for us to get together and spend 2 full days together with a lovely dinner the evening in between and perhaps a social outing, and then come back and have a second day of a meeting. That is probably not going to be a good agenda for a virtual meeting. No one is going to be able to pay attention for that long, and being connected for that long is just not necessarily practical. So think about your agenda. Are there things that we could be doing collaboratively that don't require us to all be on a video conference or a conference call? Could we, for example, use some digital discussion tools securely to have a conversation, not a vote, but maybe just a conversation, back and forth, sharing a document? Do we have other ways that we can share information besides having to talk about it? And I would say that is particularly true for things that happen at meetings all the time. Many of us have been to board meetings where we sit there passively while we listen, and that can be very helpful to get a briefing on something. But right now, when we're doing all virtual meetings, that time is so precious. We want to use that time for strategic level discussion. We want to use that time so wisely because we only have a finite amount of attention from the people that are dialing in. So really thinking carefully about the agenda. Are there other ways to handle the briefing part, the information only part of the meeting? And can we just use the video conference as an opportunity to speak with one another and to collaborate together verbally on something? And then finally, many people have been wondering about whether or not to record the meeting. Again, I am not legal counsel. You should absolutely talk with your own attorneys. But I'm of the mind that if you haven't recorded your meetings in the past, why would you start recording just because you're doing this virtually? It's not a good idea. If you don't have a standard of always recording your meetings, I wouldn't recommend that you start just because you're meeting virtually. Once you start recording your meetings, that may be something you need to do forever from that point forward. So definitely give that some thought, and absolutely always check with counsel. Don't take my word for it. Check with counsel. Figure out what is correct for you. The meeting itself is going to be different. One of the things that is very different in this time of being at home, and maybe you're not in a place that is fully locked down anymore. And if not, good for you, and tell me where you are. I'd love to come visit. But if you do happen to still be locked down, distraction is a real situation. And while these are all, kind of humorous examples, the famous BBC interview where the child was coming in the room, people dancing in the background, maybe we have a huge collection of people together and you can see there's all different kinds of backgrounds happening here. What is interesting is from a board perspective, it's not just humorous, is it? None of the people we see in these pictures is wearing headphones. And so if we were actually having a board meeting with any one of these individuals, we might have to ask ourselves whether the people in the background are attending the meeting. That seems like a silly thing to say, but think about it. If we were in a room, in a boardroom, and there was someone sitting in the back, we would have to acknowledge that there was someone sitting in the back listening in on the meeting. And if people are participating remotely, we may need to know that the board member is the only person listening into the meeting and participating in the conversation. And when we are all together in our homes, we can't necessarily guarantee that unless we're wearing headphones. So just something to think about. Again, check with counsel, talk this over with your board, but those are the kinds of things that are different when we meet for board conversations than if we're meeting for other things. Finally, the technology itself can actually impact governance. So I just mentioned using headsets as an example. But there's another example. Using, what video conference system you use can impact what happens during the meeting. So here's a great example. Right now, we are all connected over Zoom webinar, and this is giving us the opportunity to broadcast this live to YouTube, which is wonderful for a webinar. You have the opportunity to ask questions and to send chat messages, and you have the opportunity to, put little icons of things that you like or dislike. Those are great features for a webinar. Are those appropriate for a board meeting, though? Anything that we might type into the chat script or anything we might type into a question and answer box might have to go in the minutes, because that is, in fact, some communication that has been given by a director during the proceedings of a board meeting. And that might be fine. That might be no problem at all, but you're going to want to think that through. You're also going to want to think through how you handle things like when members come in and out. Do we need to note that in the minutes? Let's say we're about to have a vote. Someone has clearly just walked into the screen. Did they just join the meeting? Have they been listening in the whole time? Do we know? Do we have to stop for a moment and ask? So the technology does have a little bit of an impact on what happens during the meeting. And of course, making sure that everybody has the appropriate hardware, software, and connectivity and the training, quite frankly, to fully participate in the meeting becomes very important, doesn't it? Because if they don't have those things and we don't know that they have those things, how can we make sure that they are able to fully engage? And here's another, quick example of a way that the technology could influence governance. I hope this never happens to you. I'm going to say that first. But I was in a meeting. I will not name names. I was in a meeting and we were having a wonderful, robust discussion, but someone clearly felt that a particular member had been speaking for long enough and muted that member. Now, it was incredibly inappropriate, because you would never in a live meeting go over and clamp your hand over someone's mouth. And that was in essence what had happened. And the reason that happened was because they had this new capability of this technology and they just used it. So it's incredibly important to know how those sorts of things really are playing out. That was totally inappropriate and uncalled for and was called out and stopped. But it's useful to have conversations about these sorts of things before you embark on this process. It's not appropriate to mute a member, just like in a live meeting. The chair should have said, I want to ask if thank you for your comments, and I want to ask you to pause because I'd like to make sure that we are engaging the entire board and we have not yet heard from, and maybe call a name and invite that person to speak. So as a chair, you do have to be a bit more disciplined. And yes, if someone is talking for a long time, that's a useful time to use a webcam or to maybe use a hand raise and to kind of get their attention and say, could we please pause? I want to make sure we hear from the rest of the group. Thank you for your comments. Let's make sure we hear from the rest of the group. Those are just good chair facilitation skills. Don't let the technology be the crutch. That's not the right approach. Additionally, there is another conundrum. I mentioned before with video conferencing, only one person can speak at a time. So how you engage the entire group becomes a little bit more challenging. And I mentioned one way you can do this as a chair. You can use that list of who is participating in the conference call that shows up on the side of the web conference to understand who's there. And you can then call on people. And in particular, if you've not heard from someone, and you really want to know, are they hearing this? How are they feeling about it? Are they participating? Are they engaged? You can ask. And that's a very powerful strategy. Sometimes what I have done, I am the vice chair of one of the boards that I serve on. And recently I conducted the meeting in the chair's absence. Chair was able to join a little bit later in the meeting. And so I was conducting the beginning of the meeting. And there was a discussion that we had, and we had a couple of members who were very passionate about the topic. They were talking, they were making great points, but I could see in the webcam that there were two members that looked a little uncomfortable. And so when they were finished with their comments, I said, I'd like to make sure to hear from these two members who we have not yet heard from. Would you please speak? And I invited them to speak. And I'm glad that I did, because what they then volunteered changed the tenor of the conversation. Now, if we had all been together in a boardroom, I hope that that same thing would have happened, but it wouldn't have been quite so formal, because you don't have the situation where someone is dominating the conversation all by themselves and it's sequential. So it does take a little bit more effort and a little bit more work. And sometimes the conversations might need to last a little longer because of this formality and this discipline that you have to exert. but it is worth it. And you can then have an opportunity to engage with everyone. Then finally, I think another very powerful strategy is to make sure you're using the wraparound technology appropriately. So if you have a board platform, you often in those board platforms have a way to mark notes on the documents that you have for the meeting. So you get the documents via your secure board platform. Again, I wouldn't recommend that you're emailing documents to one another because, as I mentioned at the outset, cybercrime has become a huge problem during this pandemic. While we are all working remotely, bad actors are recognizing this and they're taking advantage of that by sending us lots of bad email with phishing links. And many of us are falling prey to that, and that's very bad. That can compromise an entire company's systems and data. So don't send each other email attachments and links. Instead, you put things into your secure board platform. But when you do that, you may have the opportunity to mark up notes for your meeting and then share those with your board colleagues. So I might post a little sticky note, a virtual sticky note on a document and say, I have a question about this, and then share that with the group. And that collaboration might happen leading up to the meeting. When we were writing the book, Governance in the Digital Age, one of the companies that we called attention to was Netflix, which I think you've probably heard of Netflix by now. You've probably been watching a lot of Netflix during the pandemic. They're a very interesting organization because they practice something they call radical transparency, which that's a whole other topic for a different webinar. But one aspect of that is that their board collaborates on documents getting ready for the next meeting. So they start out with an online memo that's put together by the management team and sent to the board. And in the weeks leading, or the days, I should say, leading up to the meeting, the board is very active in that document, posting things, highlighting things, asking questions, putting related resources into that file. And when they actually, and all of this, by the way, is happening in the public eye, which is really fascinating because they practice radical transparency. When they then get to the board meeting, that interactive file is the material for the meeting. There isn't anything else. There's not like a different agenda that gets sent out the night before. There's no 98 slide deck that's sent out. It is this thing that they've all created together. So they've all collaborated before the meeting. And when they get to the meeting, then what they're doing is just finishing up that collaboration and clarifying their positions and voting on what direction to go. That's a fascinating way to work because their meetings then have a very clear purpose. The meeting is really about coming together to get to some level of consensus or a vote where they can move on and take an action on something. But the work leading up to that has been something they've been doing all along. And I'd encourage you, look, that might be an extreme example, and it might not be right for every organization. Clearly, it won't be. But I do think this idea of what do we use the meeting for, and what can we use the rest of the technology tools that are available to us to collaborate, it's worth a conversation. I think it's worth a consideration of how we maybe work a little bit differently. That brings me to the end of what I had planned to share with you today, but I do have a few additional resources that I'd recommend to you. One is an ebook that I recently wrote with a colleague, Helen Baker, who is the corporate secretariat for the Coca-Cola European Partners. We wrote a book together, ebook together on virtual meetings, and so you can sort of see some of our guidance there. That link is available, and you can just download that for free. We also have what we've put together called our Virtual Meetings Hub for Diligent, and that's at insights.diligent.com/virtual-meetings. There you'll also find some short videos that I've put together for you. So if anything that I've said resonates with you, you're looking for some extra pointers, there's a couple short videos there as well. And then finally, if you'd like to get additional ongoing information from us, we do have a weekly newsletter. Right now, it's sort of been focused on what's happening, around the world in terms of current events and how that impacts governance. But we continue to evolve it as the situation evolves. So if you'd like to continue to hear from us, we'd welcome that opportunity. That is what I had to share with you in this session, and then I'll be happy to take questions when we get to that part of the presentation.
Thanks a lot for that, Dottie. It was actually really insightful, and I've got a lot of questions myself, but there have been questions from our participants. But before we move on to that, and before I ask them, we actually have time it is now time for our Insights Exchange with Hakun, who I mentioned at the top of the hour is the Senior VP and Head of External Relations for Telna Group and Chairman of Digi.com. And if you are Malaysian, Digi definitely is a household name and was the first, just in case you didn't know, to actually launch and operate a fully digital cellular network. Now, Haakon has more than a decade of board experience. He has extensive experience in the telecom and digital industry in both Europe and Asia. In Telenor, he's actually held various positions, including Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer of DTAC, which is Telenor's telco in actually Thailand. I welcome him to this meeting. Haakon, you're there?
Yes, thank you so much, Nadia.
All right, just a couple of things before we move on. It's that you've done this a long time, right? So how are boards viewing governance and their oversight role amid sort of these accelerated trends in remote work, virtual meetings, digital collaborations in post-COVID-19 world? And how do you think it actually impacts the future of corporate decision-making process? Because I've been to Digi's office, I know how open plan you guys are, you know, but how has COVID changed that?
Well, let me first thank you for the opportunity, and also thank Dottie for sharing a lot of very valuable insights and a lot of commonalities with a lot of the things that we've been going through in our own journey. And then in the beginning also, Michelle mentioned in her opening that I shared the virtual AGM this year, but I was not in KL, and then adhering to the regulations and the MCO, the board elected Tan Sri Saw to actually chair that meeting. But of course I was present virtually, as were the majority of the other directors as well. Now to the question, two main reflections maybe, Nadia. The first one is, of course, that a lot of things have changed around us in the last couple of months. Personally, I've been sitting in the same room now since 4th of March in Singapore,
Wow.
doing everything, so to speak, when it comes to business meetings, interactions with all my people around the region. And I think that's a big change. And of course, I have not been able to go to a restaurant. Well, I did that last weekend for some makan in Singapore. It was good to be able to sit down and actually not do that at my own dining table. So things are looking brighter. But there is also some things that hasn't changed. And I think in the boardroom, there is a change of priorities in this COVID period. I mean, providing employees a safe work environment, protecting customers that interact with us, contributing to the support of society's response to the crisis. And of course, very importantly in the board, chartering the business through a very difficult time. But if you think about the board role and the governance role, the responsibilities in the boardroom has not changed much despite the change of the circumstances, right? So as directors, our fiduciary duties, remains the same. And in Digi, we uphold the same good governance standards and the expectations to ourselves and to management in regards to both accountability and transparency throughout this period. So that hasn't changed. And I will touch on that later, because sometimes, I get asked whether digitalization or virtualization will change corporate governance, or whether digitalization will be ruled by the corporate governance frameworks, right? And I think, yes, technology is emerging, but so are the governance frameworks. And in my view, the governance codes that we have today, they have been developed over many years and provide strong frameworks to operate within. There is broad consensus, in my view, on that point about lawmakers, regulators, practitioners, and among directors and businesses. So in Digi, when we discuss this, of course, our main focus and where we align our practices is in adherence with these rules and regulations. And we look to the regulations to find guidance. And if we don't find it, we seek it, because and that is also applicable to how it is to operate in a more digital world. An example, there was a lot of questions, I believe, among many public listed companies when the CMO came into effect. How are we now going to about conducting AGMs, because everybody was moving into the AGM season, so to speak. And I think it was very clarifying when Security Commission came out then with their guidance note on the 18th of April, because we felt as a board that this was not, on such an important topic, was not an unprecedented circumstances. It was not a topic that we ourselves should decide, but we would rather get the guidance from the regulators, because this was applicable to many listed companies.
Yeah, so you have a standard across the board, so to speak, so not
exactly.
so scattershot.
No, and also I think when you are a listed company, you need to make sure that you adhere to the strictest governance setup, and you need to follow the advice and the guidance from the regulator. Having said that, though, I do think that, you know, as regulators and lawmakers have improved the frameworks for corporate governance over the last two and a half decades, I think that the pandemic gives many businesses the extra push to accelerate digitalization, right? And hence the regulatory frameworks needs to be possibly better, more in sync to what I like Dottie said, that the next normal. It's a lot of talk about the new normal. Maybe this is more the next normal. And then we need to ensure that we integrate a more digital way of work also when it comes to the way we operate a company and a board. But it shouldn't come, in my view, at the expense of good corporate governance standards. It should actually enhance such standards.
So here's the thing about shareholders meetings. I've attended quite a few in my lifetime, of course. Do you think virtual AGMs, based on your experience, actually offer greater interactive connectivity with your shareholders because you're not in a big crowd? You're doing this online, maybe people are writing in their questions or their votes. Do you think virtually it actually makes shareholders more engaged, or in your opinion, is there pros and cons to kind of both?
No, I think it's different. So you need to plan for it, that it is different, and you need to bring with you a different mindset. And I think the COVID-19 experience in a way also teaches us a lesson that, you know, or it challenges a lot of the conventional wisdoms. So you need to maybe think differently, bring with you a different mindset, which goes both for the company, the directors and the board, but also goes for the wider shareholder community. And I do think that, you know, every company needs to find a strategy to manage them through this next stage or coming out of the pandemic. But it's also clear, as I mentioned, that this has accelerated, you know, the way we adapt digital solutions across various sectors of society and integrate and embed digital in our lives. So from our experience, I think the virtual AGM gave us, I mean, we got the same experience as we would in a more analog AGM, but it gave us a wider reach, I would say. You know, there are shareholders, quite a lot of shareholders, which never comes to the AGM venue. And then when you actually broaden this and you make this available digitally, you see also other shareholder groups attend the meeting, which maybe wasn't there when you had the physical meeting. All things equal, I think it's at least worthwhile to consider a virtual AGM as an alternative, and potentially also consider the hybrid model. Right? You know, the code and the regulations in Malaysia allows for a hybrid model where you still have a physical venue, but you also allow for shareholders to join virtually. I think in Digi we are evaluating this year's AGM, can come to that, taking shareholders' feedback. And of course, we will take this into account when we start thinking about planning how we are going to conduct the 2021 AGM.
Actually, what is the feedback so far? Can you just give us a sort of little insight? Because DG, like you said, had their meeting. Please share your experience before we move on to the Q&A in terms of sort of the challenges and the expectations, and of course, like all the feedback from all quarters.
Yeah, so overall, I think the feedback was good, Nadia. It proved to be as effective as a physical meeting. And I think, but that also is very much linked to Digi being a very digital ready company, right? So we are helping businesses and consumers in a way and further their digital life, and it's at the core of our business. And we are a company which are belonging to a larger family, which means that we work digitally, connected digitally, collaborated digitally for a long time. We have a board which has board members which do not reside in Malaysia, and our digital board journey started many years ago by moving into a safe and secure board platform. We conduct quite a number of our board meetings during the year as virtual, and I think during the COVID-19 period, that experience has actually been very well and important to us as we have charted through the crisis with more frequent communication and frequent decision making. But some of the, I mean, if you are considering to conduct a virtual AGM, Dottie covered, some very important practices for board meetings. For AGM, I think it starts with your, reviewing your articles of association, right? You need to make sure that you have the necessary provisions within your constitution to be able to conduct a virtual AGM. The second thing is, of course, to choose a technical platform. And it's easy when you choose a technical platform to choose something that would allow for a very rich experience. But I do think that you need to keep the shareholders' experience in mind more than your own experience. Different shareholders have different bandwidth connectivity. They have different devices which they will actually connect to the AGM, and hence it's super important to consider that rather than trying to choose a very fancy and advanced solution which would allow with a lot of functionality, because I think the bandwidth might not support that. But there are one thing which is very important when you choose the platform, and that is the ability to have a live Q&A tracker. A virtual AGM should not make the shareholders' opportunity to interact with the company and the board less than what it would have been in a physical venue. So for us, we track this live Q&A. We follow that up, and we were able to answer those questions throughout the session. Secondly, the important point around the platform is information security. And that is very important. It's about the information that you are transmitting, but it's also about securing the integrity of the meeting. You are actually voting, right, on very important matters in this meeting for the company, right. And you need to make sure that you have that integrity intact. Communication is key. So you need to communicate clearly, early to the shareholders, how to join, what kind of information will be available to them. Make content that you have not issued in your notice to the AGM, and that is not in the annual report, like presentations you will be using, for example, available online so that people can go to your investor relations website to get the slides from there. I think one clear improvement, which we also notice, is the voting process, because in a digital world, you can actually open the voting at the beginning of the meeting. Agendas for these meetings are rather set given the regulatory requirements, but you can actually open the voting already at the outset of the meeting, which would allow shareholders to actually consider throughout the meeting how they want to vote. Not in the old world, at least the way we've done it, we've kind of saved the voting till the end of the meeting. So here you kind of have the opportunity to vote. Virtual meeting etiquette, we've been doing this for a long time. It's been touched on many times, and Dottie had a good example with the children running in and out. And I think, even though we've done this for many years, it's always important to have that reminder. And then, of course, it helps. Sorry?
I said definitely, yeah, because I didn't even think about whether, if somebody from your family wanders into the room, that person now part of this meeting?
Correct.
Has this person now been exposed to secrets that maybe they shouldn't have? So yes.
And you don't want, and there are strict guidelines and regulations when it comes to who are allowed to attend an AGM, right? So there are these considerations you need to think about as well. And then, of course, it helps if you, as a company, have already are a little bit more digital mature. And maybe the last thing, which I think in these days a lot of businesses are thinking about, it is, of course, very cost efficient to have a virtual meeting, because it allows you to, in a way, you don't have to have a venue. You can run this very, very differently. You disseminate information very differently. I'm not saying that this should be the most important point, but it is definitely also part of the considerations.
And with that, we'll actually move on to the Q&A. So I invite Dottie back to join you, Håkon, for this. And because it's funny that you finished on that note. Welcome back, Dottie, by the way. And because we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just jump straight in. And the first one, and it's not just from Leonard Arif, it is from a couple of other people as well. I think this is maybe more for Håkon, where the traditional board remuneration is a fee and meeting allowances. Do you actually see remuneration strategy changing with virtual platforms? You were just mentioning, right? You can run it a bit cheaper, Håkon. What's your view on this?
No, I think that remuneration is not necessary. So we have changed the structure in Digi. We do not have meeting allowances anymore. We have moved to a full fixed remuneration on the year, because we do believe that the responsibility as a director is independent of how many meetings you indeed attend. And hence, I don't see that a virtual setup will change the way we would view remuneration. I think it's much more related to the responsibility on the board, the regulations that you need to adhere to, the workload that you need to take on as a director, which I think has grown. And I don't necessarily foresee that the virtual way of operating will make that workload any less.
Okay. So then this question I think is for the both of you. What I got Francis is asking, please ignore the cat. The virtual board meetings is the way of the future. Should the company assist the board to be properly equipped in terms of technology, set up hardware to ensure that there are no barriers to a good meeting? In terms of all the experience you've seen, what has been the trend that you've seen in virtual meetings in recent times?
I can probably take a stab at that if you like, and then Hakan, you can add. And by the way, Nadia, we'll have to enter your cat into the minutes as a participant.
Yes, I am I apologize for that. Usually
so
this doesn't interest her at all. Continue.
That's so funny. So it's a good question. What we've been hearing more so from the companies that we've been speaking with is that they are making sure that their board members are prepared to be able to participate fully in the meetings, more so than expecting the director to do it themselves. And in the same way that you would, make sure that they could get to a physical meeting, maybe you would be providing transportation reimbursement and paying expenses. They're looking at this as just another type of expense that they need to provide for. And that includes not just, potentially equipment, but also training, making sure that the person is going to be able to use the equipment successfully, having someone who is maybe on call during the meeting to be available for any, anything that should come up. I mean, just actually like the webinar we're attending here, there's quite a large team from ICDM that is helping us out to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So you would think about the same type of approach for the board meetings. And Hakan, I would imagine it's very similar for the virtual AGMs. Is that true?
Yeah, so the virtual AGM becomes a little bit different, Tori, because you will depend on then the shareholders' own ability to connect. So whether it is a laptop or a mobile phone or a tablet, I think. Hence, also my comment about the platform you choose. Make sure you are choosing a platform which cuts across a number of devices, because you have there's no way you can control that. When it comes to the board, I would say that you need to enable the board the same way that you would enable the employees of the company to take part in the digitalization of the business. You want them to be effective, then of course the board needs to assume the responsibility to help also the board get on board. And I think there needs to be a sync, right, between the companies. So if you are a very analog company and a very digital board, that might not be the right sync, but at the same time, you cannot have a very digital business and a very analog board. So one way or the other, these two things actually needs to come together.
Actually, in both your cases, I think people will be interested. It is a lot about mindset shift, as we have mentioned. How do you even start that process with your board, getting them even comfortable with this idea of doing things virtually? Because Hakan, you're mentioning, DG, of course, is very digital. They know their way forward. But what of analog companies? It's forcing them to digitize, right? But where do people even start? I think people can feel a bit helpless with this.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not so sure I have a lot of good answers, Nadia, because our industry is most probably different in a way, because we are at the forefront of digitalization. It's at the core of what we do, helping consumers and businesses take the full advantage of a digital life. But I would most probably, I mean, sometimes, when you are going through this crisis, it's sort of an opportune time to actually make the first step, to actually build on this crisis and as a kind of a platform of urgency to change. Because I agree with Dottie. I don't think the current post-pandemic situation is going to be over anytime soon. So I think that's the first one. Secondly, I do believe that we will eventually move this way, as a lot of other sectors of the economy. I mean, in the old days, you had to go to the hawker center to Tapao. Today, you have Grab to deliver the food to you, and the majority of the people do that. So I think you can choose to kind of take small steps, and maybe that's the best example that I can give. Start small, master it, and then move on in your journey. But I'm sure Dottie has more experiences here than I do from other sectors.
Thank you. Yes, I would agree with you actually. In terms of the change for board meetings specifically, I've been working in the area of technology for board meetings for about 15 years. And I would say that during that whole time, you would have some directors and some boards that would adopt the technology faster than others. And it's been so fascinating that this process that seemed to be taking this very long time and kind of going along in the steady path in the span of about 2 months, everyone became a digital board. Just
Mm.
overnight, necessity is definitely the mother of invention. I think, there was no choice. And so everyone just found, well, we'll just figure this out and we'll just do this. And I think it was the mind shift, Nadia, to use your word, I think that was the most important piece. It was just a mind shift of, we don't really have another option. There is no other option. We must make this work. And once you have that attitude, you can make it work. And so I think having had this experience, what we're hearing from directors is that they don't really think they're as concerned about this anymore. They don't love by and large, most of them do not love doing virtual meetings. They don't love that as the primary way to meet. They still like to get together. And there is a lot to be said about getting together physically, right? We build trust that way. We get to know each other that way. And I'm thinking it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, because as this situation, at least here in the US, just continues and is getting worse. I mean, today we actually had the highest count of coronavirus cases of the entire pandemic today. Fascinating. It's just getting worse. So as this continues to go on, I'm going to be interested to see what happens when we now have new directors joining us. When we all know each other already, and this is just a new way that we're meeting, that's one thing. But when we start to onboard new directors and we don't know each other yet, and our entire experience and our entire relationship is based on a digital presence, that is going to be very interesting to see what happens. We're going to have to figure it out. I think we're not going to have a choice, and we're going to figure it out. I think it's going to be very interesting.
It's going to be very interesting. Now, Haakon, I know you will have to go. We will continue the Q&A with Dottie in a bit, but please, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you so much for giving us your insight and your perspective. So I will let you go and what do you call it? Let you on your way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. So we'll continue on with Dottie for a couple more questions before we sort of wrap up. This main thing I noticed here is that because we're talking about the digital side, Dato' Sihar here is saying that recordings are helping with the taking of accurate minutes. Do you agree with this?
That's a great question. And yes, I mean, I think there are many, many companies that have, recorded their meetings for a very long time. The point that I was making was not that, always recording meetings is bad. I'm not suggesting that. I think what I'm saying is that there are a number of companies that had never recorded their meetings. And then all of a sudden, because they were meeting virtually and there's an easy record button, they thought, oh, we'll just record this and won't that make it easier? And my suggestion is just talk to counsel. Talk to your general counsel, speak with your colleagues in the legal team to just make sure that that is not going to get you into some trouble. Because one of the things that is definitely true, and maybe this is more true in the US than other places, in the US, we tend to be very litigious. But if you have never recorded your meetings, and then all of a sudden during the pandemic, you begin recording each meeting, and then you stop, that is going to be a big problem. Why is there only this one set of, 8 meetings that were recorded in history? That's not going to be good. That's not going to look good for the company. It could raise a lot of questions from shareholders. It could potentially raise some questions from regulators. So I'm just suggesting you should talk to counsel. That's what I'm suggesting. Now, if you've always recorded your meetings and that's a good way to, have an accurate record for the minutes, then it's fine. There's no reason not to continue. It is easy. It's extremely easy when you're doing a virtual meeting. I would just suggest think that through.
Would it be okay if you started recording during the pandemic and just continued on recording?
Of course. Yeah, of course. Again, I mean, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, good or bad. What I'm saying is just be careful. That's all. Just, know what you're getting into and make sure you speak to counsel. I will say, sometimes people will think, well, if we just record the meeting, then we don't even need to take the minutes. The recording can serve as the minutes. And I just don't know that I agree with that. I mean, minutes tend not to be a word for word transcript. Minutes tend to serve a different purpose. They should really be there to highlight the main decisions of the meeting. They should be there to kind of highlight the main points of action within the meeting. maybe even to provide a little bit of a summary, but they're not usually a word for word transcript, because a word for word transcript, to be candid, isn't as useful. If we as a board member want to go back and have a better understanding of what happened at a meeting, having to slog through an entire word for word transcript is almost like reattending the whole meeting. It's not as helpful as seeing a nicely summarized set of the points that were made, a nicely summarized set of the actions that were taken, and the decisions that were made. And again, depending on where you are, depending on what type of company you are, organization you are, and the feelings of your council, what your minutes look like is going to change. So different companies have different feelings about this. I mentioned Netflix. They are by far the most extreme example. They really do provide word for word transcripts of everything. It's their corporate culture. But I will tell you, there have been a lot of articles written about how difficult that culture is. It's not for everyone. It's like living your life in a fishbowl. Everyone sees everything all the time. It's very stressful. So it's not necessarily, again, good or bad. It's just you want to be aware of what things could signify for your company and what liability and risk that might put you in. So just think that through.
Before we wrap up, there is one question, and I think this is one that probably on everybody's mind as well. Eventually, a vaccine will be found. As you say, we'll have the next normal. And there is this overwhelming urge to go back to the way things are. But the thing is, once a vaccine is found and we've gotten a bit accustomed to sort of this lifestyle, what do you think are the things that we should bring forward into this next phase of, let's say, humankind or working, of people's working life? What do you think we will take, and what do you think people will probably sort of leave behind?
Great question. I certainly don't have a magic crystal ball to tell you exactly what's going to happen, but I do have a couple of guesses based on all the conversations that we're having with directors. A couple of things that have really risen to the top in those conversations. Number one is that there are aspects of the virtual meetings that directors really like. One of the things that we've been hearing over and over again that they really like is that when they need to just have a transactional conversation and make a decision, it is much more efficient. And it doesn't require them to have to get on a plane. It doesn't require them to potentially be jet lagged and lose time in travel. It doesn't require them to have to pack a certain outfit to wear. They can just show up on camera, have a meeting, maybe it lasts a few hours or even just an hour, and they make a decision, and that's it. They're already home. There's no commute. And it's also, in some regards, I think a little bit less expensive for the company. Also a little bit less expensive for the planet. We're not jumping on planes. We're not using the greenhouse gases to get places. We're limiting a little bit that carbon footprint. And that seems to be attractive as well to many of the directors that we've been speaking with. I think one of the things that's important to think about is I do think about it as next normal, because I don't think this thing that we're in right now is what will be normal forever. I
Yes.
do think there is a next normal. I don't quite know what that looks like, because the truth is, even if there's a vaccine tomorrow, I don't know that we have all the same flights available to us that we used to, all the same hotels available to us that we used to, all the same restaurants available to us that we used to have, all the same, social outing opportunities, because a lot of places, quite frankly, have gone out of business. This has been a dramatic shift in our economy globally. And a lot of industries are really hurting that would support physical meetings. The travel industry being the first one, and the hospitality industry being the second, and then retail on top of that. So I think it's going to be some time before we could even get back to what we had before. It's going to take some time. And then we're going to really think about what's the purpose of having an in-person meeting, and that might be reserved for very special things. Maybe we have fewer of them, and maybe we then are using these tools to do other things. One of the other things that has been rising out of the conversations, then I'll end here, is directors also are finding this new fluidity in the conversation and the communication they're having with their companies during this pandemic to be very attractive. They like the idea that they're much more in the know all the time of what's happening. It makes them feel better that, they can do a better job. They can really be supportive of the management team and also caution the management team when necessary, because they have a much sort of, better feeling of what's going on day to day. They're not in the way, but they're just much more in the know than they maybe have ever been, because they're having weekly calls or weekly updates all the time. And I think that's something directors are going to be reluctant to give up. I think we now are going to be in an era where directors are going to expect a much more fluid and open conversation flowing in both ways, and where directors are going to be much more proactive about finding out information about their companies. We already had an indication of this. We put a report out in January from the Diligent Institute called Beyond the Boardroom, which I'd encourage you to check out on our website at diligentinstitute.com. This report showed in our surveys, we asked directors, how do you prepare for board meetings? And over 60% told us that they do their own individual research before they attend each board meeting. So it's already something directors are doing. And I think we're going to see more of this. I think it's going to become a new way that we think about being a director, really always being curious, always being a student of the business.
What a fantastic way to end that. Thank you so much, Dottie. On behalf of everybody here, I thank you so much for your insights, for joining us so late at night from the States. Thanks again. With that, we've come to the end of our webinar for today's, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for all your participation. Thank you so much for all your questions. I am so sorry we can't get to all of them, but they have been very much appreciated. As always, ICDM would love to hear from you. Please use the survey links in the chat box or the QR code to provide your feedback and topics of interest. There's a whole bunch of programs available on ICDM's website. Michelle did actually mention them as well, but among them, sort of Aspiring Directors Immersion Program, affiliate membership and board ready screening, director sourcing, placement services. There's a lot, so just head over to ICDM. And we will be having a few more upcoming sessions, so please watch this space or register your interest with development at icdm.com.my or visit icdm.com.my. And with that, it's been my pleasure to be your moderator for this session. Everybody have a good weekend and everybody stay safe.